Thank you, everyone, for attending here. We're gonna begin. Our format today is that my colleagues and I are going to present our strategy document for about 40 or 45 minutes, and then we're going to open up for some questions. You can use the Q&A bar there to type things in, and then we will answer them either typing them in or live. Just to let people know, the initial presentation that the three of us are going to do will be recorded, and that will be, as I answered in the Q&A, that will be posted and made available for people to view who cannot be here for the actual presentation, but we will not include the Q&A, right, just for security reasons for that. My name is Matt Walton. I'm an associate professor in the Department of Political Science at the University of Toronto, and one of the founders of MyPACK, the Myanmar Policy and Community Knowledge Hub. My work focuses particularly on Buddhism and politics in Myanmar, and also on ethnic politics in the country and in the region as well. I'll ask my colleague Napas Thane to introduce himself.
Hi, my name is Napas. I am a research fellow here at the MyPACK Hub as well. And over to you, Nisha.
Hi, Nisha Toomey. I have a PhD from OISE at the University of Toronto. Spent almost 5 years working on the Thailand-Myanmar border and did some field work there for my dissertation. And I'm a research fellow at MyPACK.
Great, so I'd like to begin our presentation today actually by recognizing the stewards of the land that we are on here in Toronto and the land on which the University of Toronto sits. This land is the territory of the Wendat and Petun First Nations, the Seneca, and most recently the Mississaugas of the Credit River. This territory is also the subject of the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, which is an agreement between the Iroquois Confederacy and the Confederacy of the Ojibwe and allied nations to peaceably share and care for the resources around the Great Lakes in this area of what is today in Ontario. Today, this meeting place of Toronto is still the home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we're grateful to have the opportunity to live and to work in this community and on this territory. Land acknowledgement is an important practice for those of us at the University of Toronto to situate ourselves both in gratitude to those that came before us and also as a way of acknowledging ongoing injustice and the ongoing effects of land theft and the denial of Indigenous sovereignties here. When we think about sovereignty and relationships with land, we know that those same dynamics are at play in complicated ways across Myanmar as well. Many ethnic and Indigenous groups in Myanmar have their own deeply felt connections to land. That helps, for many of them, helps to define them as a people. And in the midst of this more than 3 years long civil war, it's easy for us to kind of think of land primarily as territory that is won by opposed armed groups and about control of land in that way. But it's also crucially that, for MyPACK, as we look to center and foreground community knowledge in our research and policy activities, that we make space for different communities' understanding of land, their relation to it, and the way that this needs space in any transitions in Myanmar as well. And so it's important for us to begin with an explicit acknowledgement of land for us here in Toronto, and then also in regard to Myanmar politics as well. So for folks who are not familiar with our work, the Myanmar Policy and Community Knowledge Hub is a relatively new institution, but it's made up of folks who have been engaged with Myanmar for a long time. We were founded in February 2024, and we're housed at the University of Toronto, specifically at the Asian Institute, which is the Munk School of Global Affairs and Public Policy. We are funded by the International Development Research Center, IDRC's Knowledge for Democracy Myanmar project. So some of you may know its acronym of K4DM, and also by Global Affairs Canada. I do want to say that the output here, the strategy, the recommendations, is funded by these organizations, but is not officially endorsed by either Global Affairs Canada or IDRC. MyPACK's fellows include students and scholars of and from Myanmar. Many of us are based here in Canada, but we also have colleagues that are based around the world, affiliated with different research institutions. And as I mentioned before, we really have an emphasis. This organization was formed very conscious of the ways that most of our fellows have multiple kind of hats and feet in multiple communities. Almost everybody is a member of some diaspora organization as well as a university or research organization. And so we really put an emphasis on combining academic research with the lived knowledge and experience that not only comes from our fellows, from our diaspora partners, but we want to prioritize this in our policy and our advocacy work, since this usually is not something that gets acknowledged or incorporated by decision makers. So as I said in the Q&A, the full report from today's webinar the full report here, it will be published on our website, sent out on our social media accounts today after the event. The website also has other policy briefs, research documents, and additional information and resources. So what does MyPACK do? We are active in a number of different ways. One thing is that we're providing training to our fellows in policy research, policy writing, lobbying, and communication with elected officials and different kinds of decision makers. We've been writing and providing both public and private research and policy briefs to different Canadian government ministries, officials, bureaucrats, elected officials. We have partnerships with several Myanmar National Unity Government ministries where we're working with their staff and ministers as well. And then we also have some partnerships and relationships with foreign ministries in Southeast Asia, again, engaged in Myanmar research and policy discussions. We are particularly active in collaborating with Myanmar diaspora groups here in Canada. You'll hear more about those in a moment. Just to give a few examples here, we've hosted NUG ministers and officials for town halls to engage with the diaspora community here and also at the University of Toronto. And we recently hosted photojournalist Greg Constantine an exhibition of his new work, Ek Kale, which tells a kind of different story of Rohingya history and belonging based on kind of personal documents and official documents that are collected from the Rohingya diaspora around the world. We've organized events around that, including a community memory event with the diaspora community in the GTA. And then we engage in public education on Myanmar and its diaspora, specifically here in Canada, but then also globally. I'll pass it on to Napas here to talk a little bit more about the communities here.
Yes, thank you, Matt. So I will talk a little bit about some of the activities going on within Canada towards Myanmar. The Burmese Canadian diaspora across various ethnic groups from Myanmar number approximately 17,000 in Canada, according to the 2021 Canadian census. Of these, approximately 9,000 were born in Myanmar, whereas the rest were born outside. The Myanmar diaspora in Canada, like in many other countries in the Western world, are deeply active and engaged in Myanmar politics abroad. Diaspora members engage in protests, cultural activities, fundraisers, and hostings of members of the pro-democracy movement in events, including from the NUG. Ever since the coup, communities here have been engaging in grassroots efforts to raise funds to support organizations on the ground in Myanmar that depend heavily on diaspora funding. These communities exhibit a form of super diversity. That means that these communities, as part of the diverse makeup of Canada, are in themselves diverse and composed of many various ethnic groups and divisions. These have led to diverging group activities, oftentimes but not always along the basis of ethnicity. Community organizations include the Burma Canadian Association of Ontario, the Rohingya Centre of Canada, and the Chin Community of Canada. Along with all of these organizations, as seen in this map on the screen, which don't even represent all of the organizations in Canada that engage in Myanmar work. On the next page, we can see some of the work that Canadian MPs have done towards the Myanmar cause. In the House of Commons, the Burma cause has support from the Parliamentary Friends of a Democratic Burma, which reconvened in its name in 2023. It's currently co-chaired by Conservative MP Garnet Jennis and Green MP Mike Morris, and vice-chaired by MP Adam Chambers. Chambers' predecessor, MP Bruce Stanton, was the longtime chair of the Myanmar-Canada Parliamentary Friendship Group, also known as the Parliamentary Friends of Burma, which has its roots in Canada to over a decade prior. Canada's acceptance of refugees and asylum seekers from Myanmar has significantly declined over the past decade. While numbers have steadily increased since 2019 and the coup, it hasn't reached levels that we saw during the 2002 to 2006 period or even the 2007 to 2015 period. On this graph, you can see a summary of Canadian aid since 2007. This graph displays aid that was distributed towards Burma or Burma border areas or Myanmar, but doesn't include funds that were sent to Bangladesh, which were included in the previous strategies. So Canada has allocated approximately $600 million towards the Myanmar and Rohingya crises from 2017 to the present. This was done in two distinct strategies. The first strategy, going over the years of 2018 to 2021, focused on the Rohingya crisis and disseminated approximately $300 million in support, whereas the second strategy broadened its focus to include the 2021 Myanmar coup and included and allocated $288 million from 2021 to 2024. As you can see, funding towards Myanmar significantly increased during the and after the fiscal year of 2016 to 2017, illustrating a strategy focused on pursuing multilateral project funding towards Myanmar aid goals from Canada. While funding increased for Canadian organizations and foreign organizations working on Myanmar, they did not increase in the same ways as we saw for the multilaterals. On the next slide, we can see some of the funding data from Canada's international assistance data towards the organizations that are funded towards Myanmar. Again, these focus on the funding provided to projects displayed as Myanmar, Burma, or Burma border areas within the data, and this specific graph focuses in on the fiscal year of 2023 to 24. The most prominent action area, which is focused on by the Canadian government towards Myanmar, is known as human dignity, followed by the action areas of inclusive governance and peace and security. As you can see, these organizations' programmings focus on the provision of health, peace initiatives, health empowerment, humanitarian aid programs, healthcare, democratic development, and many other programs. And I'll pass it on to Nisha.
Thanks. So in response to the 2016 Rohingya ethnic cleansing, mass displacement, and genocide, Prime Minister Trudeau appointed Bob Rae as special envoy. He visited the region in 2017 and produced a report titled "Tell Them We're Human: What Canada and the World Can Do About the Rohingya Crisis." This report became crucial for directing increased aid to Myanmar, Bangladesh, and keeping Myanmar on Canada's agenda. It had 17 specific recommendations with 4 overarching themes. So the themes were alleviating the humanitarian crisis and allocating aid to Myanmar and Bangladesh, engaging in the political situation of Myanmar and Bangladesh, pushing for accountability, and establishing coordination and cooperation across various actors. But there has been no substantive change in policy or overall strategy after the 2021 coup. So I'm just going to go quickly through. We engaged in quite a thorough evaluation of this report to understand how policy changes have happened or not since then. So what we found is that Canada was successful in fulfilling humanitarian aid and collaboration goals, in pursuing economic sanctions, in supporting the IIMM, and some engagements with international partners. So as Napas just went through, Canada gave just under $600 million in aid, but no support has yet been committed in the recent budget. Canada did enact sanctions, including arms embargoes, but with limited effect since Canada never provided arms to Myanmar in the first place. And then the IIMM, which is the Independent Investigative Mechanism for Myanmar, was successfully established in September 2018 with Canada's leadership and funding. Canada has also issued statements and condemnations and promoted activists, workshops, and civil society. We found Canada was not successful in incorporating Rohingya voices, in pursuing land allocation for Rohingya refugees in Bangladesh, in accepting refugees here to Canada, in helping with pursuing conflict mediation in Myanmar, and in forming a Canada Rohingya working group. Most of the support was given to international groups, and less than 1,000 refugees from Rohingya have been admitted since 2006. And as Napa showed, most of them came in 2006. So since the report, we've seen very few people actually admitted. Canada partially succeeded in establishing formal MOUs, limited support to women, and gave some limited support to women and girls, gave some support to peace operations, some promotion of human rights, and established the International Working Group. So in terms of women and girls, although it was listed as a big priority, we saw one project worth about $1 million. But no kind of results and not really that much attention to emergency responses for women and girls. We did successfully fund NGO-led peace operations, but not necessarily that many reconciliation or dialogue-based projects. The International Working Group was successfully established with 22 other states, and Canada has been raising Myanmar issues on the international stage. So key takeaways from that evaluation have informed the strategy documents that we're presenting today to try to show how we can reorient Canada's strategy. And then just to say the methods and sources that we did to undertake this detailed review of the report was we did a thorough review of Canadian spending on Myanmar since 2007. We read lots of academic, media, and gray literature, so different reports that were focused on the post-coup environment. And we did consultations with community groups, NUG ministries, ERO leaders, talked to some CDM groups, including university interim councils, and then talked with people from Myanmar-oriented CBOs, NGOs, INGOs, and funders, including Canadian-funded groups.
And so in many ways, we have designed, we understand Ambassador Ray's report to have kind of been the template for guiding Canadian strategy towards Myanmar over the last 6 years. And in the absence of a third phase strategy document from the government, we tried to model our own strategy document kind of off of Ambassador Ray's. So what we've produced here is, and we'll kind of go through these, is 16 recommendations that are separated out into 4 different themes. One is adapting to Myanmar's post-coup environment, shifting, the context there. Another is rebalancing Canada's humanitarian development aid practices overall, specifically working to empower and coordinate with local organizations and networks, localization being one of the new kind of keywords of Canada's own kind of aid guidance. Whereas Ambassador Ray's report was primarily focused on the situation following Rohingya genocide, we have kind of kept a specific emphasis on Rohingya, but specifically expanding this to emphasize Rohingya political voice and participation in Myanmar's political processes right now, as part of the resistance here. And then finally, working through bilateral diplomatic relationships and multilateral initiatives. And I'll just point out 2 other things. The full report for us, which again will be on our website, has more detailed context and also a little bit of a kind of actor mapping and things like that. We figure we don't need to go through that in detail for this audience today, but it is there. And I'll also note that what Nisha shared were some of the kind of highlights and takeaways from MyPACK's evaluation of Canada's funding for the last 6 years. And Global Affairs Canada last month published their own evaluation of their activities and spending there, and that is available on the Global Affairs Canada website. And so now we'll go through the recommendations in our report.
So the first theme of the recommendations is adapting to Myanmar's post-coup environment. The onset of the coup means that political dynamics surrounding Myanmar have significantly changed since Bob Rae released his recommendations report after his special envoy visit in 2018. The first recommendation is to officially recognize the National Unity Government of Myanmar. This will help Canada affirm its commitment to democracy, reinforce legitimacy of electoral outcomes, and further engage with the NUG's ongoing governance activities in Myanmar. This has been further been done by the EU Parliament, East Timor, and the Czech Republic. The second recommendation is to ensure that Canadian aid does not go to the junta. Ongoing sanctions from Canada have helped promote this aim. However, the Canadian government should conduct reviews to consider further sanctions and ensure that ongoing Canadian aid does not end up in the hands of the junta or its affiliates. The third recommendation is to appoint a new special envoy to Myanmar. An effective special envoy will help in deepening and expanding relationships with actors aligned against Myanmar's military government. It will also help with engaging with minority representatives in Myanmar, including the Rohingya community. Beyond that, an envoy can help to establish a whole-of-government response towards the Myanmar issue, which was recommended in the Rae report. The fourth recommendation is to provide aid and expertise to grassroots and democratic initiatives in liberated areas. Although some of these groups are new, many have long-standing histories in the region with a breadth of experience. Beyond that, groups are displaying emergent democratic processes and coalitions. These groups require support, capacity building, and amplification. Effectively supporting democratic development in Myanmar means working with these groups towards effective and democratic institutions, building local governance. Similar to the previous recommendation, the next theme is focused on rebalancing Canada's humanitarian development practices and working through local organizations and networks. Recommendation 5 is about ensuring aid distribution goes through local organizations and networks. Also known as localization, supporting local organizations with aid delivery helps to build long-term governance capacity. It also enables trust and ensures that aid reaches those at the forefront of humanitarian needs. Recommendation 6 is about expanding pathways towards more non-lethal aid distribution to stakeholders in Myanmar's opposition. The emergence of the NUG and various ethnic revolutionary organizations in Myanmar has meant that many groups interlinked with more networks of local organizations have emerged. Effective local provision of aid and development means working with the NUG and these EROs, providing non-lethal aid directly to these groups and to affiliated groups. Recommendation 7 is about supporting feminist and women's organizations in Myanmar, recognizing their role in peace and security activities. Feminist activity has emerged following the coup and focused on issues such as conflict-based sexual violence committed by the junta. Recommendation 8 is about empowering, training, and supporting young people, particularly Gen Z, engaged in pro-democracy activity and humanitarian work. The limitations these organizations face in resources and the harms they face in their development by being out of education and out of work during the war means that there's a strong need to support them in alternative ways for long-term development. Recommendation 9 is about working on building existing networks with Canadian educational institutions to provide teaching, scholarship, and other professional development activities. This is something we have seen more robustly from US aid and US programs throughout. A streamlined process for Canadian universities to also recognize credentials from non-state educational institutions in Myanmar will also support this recommendation. And recommendation 10 is about engaging with the 17,000 Myanmar diaspora network across Canada. They are represented by a variety of political and non-political diaspora groups, and this diaspora has relevant channels, partners, and access to aid provisions that will further make Canada's work in Myanmar more effective. And then I will pass it on to Nisha to carry on with the next two themes.
Thanks. So Theme 3 of our report is around continuing Canada's robust humanitarian support for the Rohingya while expanding to emphasize the Rohingyas' political voice and place as a part of Myanmar. So the recommendations under this theme are to continue strong humanitarian support for Rohingya in the refugee camps in Bangladesh. Most of the aid budget in Myanmar has been dedicated to the Rohingya in Bangladesh, and we do applaud this. We recommend that Canada does more to support Rohingya-led aid support, including educational, livelihood, and leadership training, and also to support grassroots efforts and for a political voice for Rohingya in Myanmar. So we talk about how a post-military Myanmar must include citizenship for Rohingya peoples. Given the Arakan Army's military victories, but also violence against Rohingya peoples, Canada should monitor developments in Rakhine State closely and see it as a key bellwether for the success of the revolution overall, and also support other resistance actors in pressing the Arakan Army to act responsibly and hold it accountable. Canada also needs to accept more refugees from Myanmar, especially Rohingya refugees, and make public commitments to meet the unmet commitment to resettle refugees. The number of 1,000 Rohingya is unacceptably low, considering the scale of the crisis faced by the Rohingya, Canada's wealth and resources, and the fact that there's a vibrant and committed Myanmar diaspora here ready to help people integrate into Canadian society. And since the coup, an additional 2 million people have been internally and externally displaced across Myanmar. So a much more robust refugee program is needed to give more people the chance to resettle in Canada. Theme 4 is around working through bilateral diplomatic relationships and multilateral initiatives to better support the people of Myanmar. Canada needs to see Myanmar as an important component of its Indo-Pacific strategy. The goal should be to engage with a wide range of partners, participate in more regional fora, and avoid exacerbating wider geopolitical tensions. Canada should continue to robustly use UN venues to support the resistance in Myanmar, including supporting new resolutions and encouraging enforcement of previous resolutions, while also seeking to limit the ways in which UN engagement financially or politically supports the SAC. And in terms of ASEAN, Canada should both recognize its limitations while also using meetings with it to ensure that Myanmar remains on the agenda. The focus should be on Thailand respecting the rights of refugees and migrants, and also on the possibilities of using the opportunity of a rotating chair, such as with Malaysia coming in 2025. Finally, Canada's been a leading funder of the Independent Investigative Mechanism for Myanmar. And it has the mandate of collecting documentations of crimes against humanity. While the scope has expanded since the military coup, it's not adequately resourced to process and assess this vast amount of information. Additionally, it has no mechanism to reimburse the many Myanmar people who contribute evidence, often at great personal cost and risk. So Canada should continue to support the IIMM while either expanding its mandate or partnering with others to create a body that can carry out this essential support.
So MyPACK's work has been kind of primarily oriented towards Canadian government policy and activities, right? And so again, what we've done here is earlier in 2024, we conducted a evaluation of Canada's performance on recommendations in the Ray report, right? Seeing how it had done on its own guidelines that it was using. And what we're doing here is slightly different. This is giving a kind of template for a third phase strategy, which we know the Canadian government is embarking on. But we also want to kind of pull out a few broader takeaways that are not only targeted towards Canadian engagement, but that are also kind of relevant considerations and takeaways for other countries that have been reevaluating their Myanmar strategy since the coup and recalibrating the kind of engagement and humanitarian aid that they provide. So one of the biggest recommendations, and you see this cutting across, one of the biggest takeaways that you see cutting across multiple recommendations here is to expand the range of democratic actors that foreign countries are engaging with, either through humanitarian aid or through other kind of political or peace-building channels. And in particular, and this is oriented towards democratic countries and especially federal democratic countries, a need to support emergent grassroots efforts without imposing particular models of federalism or of kind of democratic change and constitutionalism. This is something that I think many of us have seen repeatedly, especially during the kind of ceasefire eras and during the transitional period. And what we see emerging now in Myanmar is certainly imperfect, it's hesitant in some ways, but these are grassroots democratic efforts that are being built kind of from the ground up. And they need to be supported as such, right? Countries like Canada need to recognize this range of actors as working for democratic development in Myanmar. Second is that, as we've heard from my colleagues, we're particularly appreciative of Canada's focus on Rohingya needs, especially given everything that the Rohingya have experienced, especially in the last decade. But to be quite frank, the way that we've understood this, especially in consultation with Rohingya colleagues in the diaspora here, is that this cannot be accomplished simply through humanitarian aid that kind of separates out the Rohingya as distinctive actors, right? This is a moment of opportunity after the coup where more voices within Myanmar, more voices within the NUG, more voices within the diaspora are accepting Rohingya as part of Myanmar and as an essential part of Myanmar's history and Myanmar's future. And this means that support needs to not only include humanitarian aid, but needs to explicitly include political support for Rohingya voices and Rohingya institutions and organizing. One example of this is the kind of newly emergent Rohingya Consultative Council engaged with different with groups across the diaspora in Bangladesh and in Myanmar and connected to existing political processes in Myanmar through the NUCC. We think that it's very clear that sort of regardless of the outcome of the conflict with the military, Myanmar's sort of political success and democratic success is in large part contingent on whether Rohingya will be robustly included in its political future, right? And especially since there are many of these Rohingya voices are resisting the kind of pathway of armed movements, then including support for their political organization is essential here. And that needs to be seen as part of the Myanmar aid and as part of the Myanmar project. You've heard a bit about aid localization. That's another one of the takeaways that goes across a lot of these recommendations. And it includes a number of different aspects here, some of which have commonly been part of development discourse and humanitarian aid discourse for a long time. So one is thinking about the eligibility of newer groups for funding. The landscape changed after the coup, but we know that diaspora groups have essentially supported this revolution, right? And they have created the effective channels for getting aid, especially into areas not along the borders. There's been so much work of like training and capacity building with local NGOs and CBOs, but that can also be complemented by discovering and working on ways to ease reporting and evaluation requirements, which we know can be very onerous and challenging. And then thinking about how a country like Canada recalibrates the proportion of aid that's going to INGOs or UN agencies. This will be an essential part of any humanitarian aid program, without a doubt, but constant reflection on the kind of balance there and the ratios is important. you've heard a few recommendations that are in our report that are specifically focused on strengths of Canadian engagement, on success stories in there. And I think that is one of the clear sort of takeaways, as we worry about, moving into periods where some humanitarian aid budgets might be reduced, thinking about political changes, not only here in Canada, but in other neighboring countries. It's really important not to let that infrastructure and that knowledge and expertise go to waste, especially the relationship building with groups in Myanmar. So in Canada, there's been particular success in the areas of education, training, thinking about diaspora training, mentorship of diaspora youth from Myanmar here, public discourse projects. These are the kinds of things that we have been focused on. But the takeaways are to kind of like not, whatever a given country's focus and expertise has been, to continue to build that. We really want to emphasize the need for more robust collaboration with diaspora groups. Myanmar activism over the last several decades has sort of waxed and waned in terms of how governments and granting organizations work with diaspora groups. And we have found that there is such a robust space for collaboration with diaspora groups here in Canada. Again, there is the practicality and the technical knowledge of getting things into Myanmar, of knowing the situation of groups on the ground, but that needs to be kind of complemented by finding more creative ways to work with and support these groups. And then finally, I'll note the importance of opportunities for reconciliation and political development outside of Myanmar. And so, one aspect of Canada's strategy previously, prior to the coup, that was reflected in a lot of countries' strategies, was to work on sort of community reconciliation and peace building in Rakhine State specifically. Obviously, that is not possible in the same way since the coup, and especially since the recent gains by the Arakan army. And so we think it's important to continue to pay attention to the opportunities that are there, but to also look within the diaspora for opportunities outside of the context of Myanmar, right? Where people are not constrained in the same ways, where conversations can happen in different ways. And just as a one example, I mentioned earlier that we had hosted an exhibition of photojournalist Greg Constantine's Ek Kale project that showed kind of Rohingya histories through family photographs, through government documents, work documents, military service records, everything like this. For us, it was not only an opportunity to kind of learn about Rohingya lives and Rohingya histories through their own documentation, but also to kind of move forward a conversation of reconciliation here among the diaspora in Myanmar. And we did that by facilitating events that brought together different communities to kind of share their own histories in those ways, to recognize common experiences, to build relationships, especially across these divides that have been persistent over years. And so when the opportunities might not be there in Myanmar in the same way, we really think that the diaspora relationships and the diaspora spaces are a place to build this. And we've been so appreciative of the diaspora partners that we have here. As I say, this is a kind of founding ethos of MyPACK, precisely because so many of our fellows are themselves members of not just the diaspora community, but diaspora organizations. And so I think with that, we will end our formal presentation. And again, this will be, the recording here will be posted, the report will be posted, and we'll turn now to some of the questions